So hello everyone and welcome to tonight's event from the Newcastle Centre for the Literary Arts at Newcastle University. I'm Rachel Hewitt and I'm a writer and a lecturer in creative writing at the university, and I'm also director of the Newcastle Centre for the Literary Arts. And tonight we are hugely honoured to have the novelist Sarah Moss with us, discussing her most recent novel, The Fell, which was just published in the last month. But before introducing Sarah, I just want to give you a brief recap of the conversations and the speakers that NCLA has hosted this semester, and to draw your attention to our archive of events, where you can access audio and video recordings of all of these events, and indeed NCLA's events from further back too. So we began the semester with a reading and discussion by the poet John Challis, whom we're really proud at NCLA to have working with us. We then hosted the creative nonfiction writer CJ Hauser as part of our Pass the Baton series, in which each semester the interviewee from the previous term becomes the interviewer. And CJ was interviewed by the memoirist Charlie Gilmore. And next semester, CJ will be seizing the baton and becoming the interviewer and speaking to the novelist Tori Peters, author of Detransition Baby. The week after CJ's event, we hosted the prize giving and reading for the James Berry Poetry Prize. And the following week, two writers who both practice in both prose and poetry, Caleb Classes and Jack Underwood, read from and spoke about their works that deal with the experience of fatherhood. In mid-November, the journalist and memoirist Hadley Freeman read from and talked to me about her best-selling family memoir, House of Glass, the story and secrets of a 20th century Jewish family. Then at the end of the month, we hosted the Poetry Book Society Autumn Showcase, in which the poets Raymond Antrobus and Hannah Lowe read from their latest collections. A week ago, the novelist Omar El Akkad spoke about his highly acclaimed recent novel, What Strange Paradise, which was described by the New York Times as an instant classic. And the following day, NCLA hosted the MA Showcase, in which students from the MA in Creative Writing and Writing Poetry read from their most recent creative work. So if there's anything in that extensive list of events that grabs your interest and makes you feel incredibly sorry that you missed it the first time around, or if you did watch it the first time around and want to relive it, then you can access audio and video recordings of all of these events on the NCLA archive, which is found at archive.nclacommunity.org. And the program's calendar for the next semester will be up on the NCLA webpage shortly in the new year. So now it's an absolute delight and an honour to introduce tonight's speaker, Sarah Moss, who will be reading from and discussing her most recent novel, The Fell. Sarah is an astonishingly prolific and incisive novelist whose works always have their fingers on the pulse of the contemporary state of the nation. Her first novel, Cold Earth, was published in 2009, and it was followed 2 years later by Night Waking, which won the Fiction Uncovered Prize. Her next novel, Bodies of Light, was shortlisted for the Wellcome Book Prize, as were her 2015 and 2016 novels, Signs for Lost Children and The Tidal Zone. Her 2018 novel, Ghost Wall, was shortlisted for the Ondaatje Prize and the Polari Prize, and it was longlisted for the Women's Prize in Fiction. Summerwater was published to great acclaim last year in 2020, and then a month ago, The Fell was published and hailed as a tense page-turner that captures the precious warmth of human connection. And it's this novel that Sarah will be talking to us about tonight. Tonight's event is going to consist of a couple of readings and a discussion. And if there's anything that you'd like to ask Sarah during the course of the discussion, you can put it into the YouTube chat and it will make its way over to us. So it just leaves me to say, welcome, Sarah. It's lovely to have you here this evening. And it's a real sort of personal pleasure. You know, I love your writing and I'm really excited about the opportunity to hear you reading from The Fell and to sort of ask you some questions about it. I think you're going to begin with a reading from the novel. And I was just wondering if you can maybe sort of set the scene for the extract that you're going to read.
Of course, thank you very much, and it's really great to be here. I'm going to read from a section where we hear from Alice. This novel has four main characters. There's Kate, who is a waitress and folk singer in her early 40s, who's supposed to be quarantining at home for 2 weeks. She's a single mum, so she's stuck in a small cold house with a teenage boy, though they get on very well. There's her next door neighbour, Alice, who is in her 70s and is officially medically vulnerable. She's recovering from cancer treatment and she's also recently widowed. So we hear from those three and also from another character whom we may discuss later, Wob. So this bit is Alice, the older lady, Kate's neighbour. Alice has been making cookies because she's been stuck inside on her own for a long time, and that's the kind of thing people do when that happens. And she's also been singing along to 70s songs and dancing around her kitchen, but I'm not going to sing, so you'll just get the reading. Cookies. There's less than a minute between perfect and crunchy. If you're going to eat all that butter and sugar, it better be good. Not that she is going to eat all that butter and sugar. Well, maybe a couple after dinner with a very moderate spoonful of ice cream. It doesn't seem to have occurred to the government that the extremely vulnerable will be especially extremely vulnerable after months without outdoor exercise. Dancing's not going to burn off many cookies. She's going to send them special delivery tomorrow morning, the cookies. Ask Matt next door to take them to the post office and give him a few of his trouble. He can always use some feeding up. Kate keeps him on rabbit food. Not that they haven't been very kind, both of them, all the way through this. Doing her shopping when she couldn't get a delivery. And recently they've been walking or on bikes, even with the milk and tins coming up the hill. The car insurance ran out, Kate said when she asked, and it's not as if we're going anywhere anyway. Only she couldn't ask them for the things she really wants. Salt and vinegar hula hoops and the expensive bitter mints. Not with Kate working at shoots and leaves and growing her own lentils or whatever. Probably hasn't eaten a hula hoop in decades. It's infantilizing, that's what it is, having to have other people bring you food. Not that it isn't probably good for her to feel a bit policed, borrow a sense of shame since her own seems weaker by the day. And after all, why shouldn't she have crisps and chocolate if she wants them? All those years of watching her weight and she's still got cancer. It's not as if anyone cares now what a woman who never leaves her house weighs. At least she's not drinking, or only the occasional sherry at weekends. Have to mark the days somehow. This is a good batch. They're so much nicer fresh. Just one more, the big one with all the chocolate. It's just that since Mark died, she's got used to privacy, buying what she fancies, which actually used to be mostly pots of soup and remarkably expensive bread from the nice deli by the station, eating it when she likes and none of anyone else's business. She'd probably better go into another room while the cookies cool. Or put the rack in the sitting room, that's a better idea while she clears up. Newspaper on the coffee table in case of crumbs. Oh hell, but they're in isolation, aren't they, Matt and Kate? What do they call it? Self-isolating. One of those horrible new nonsensical phrases. Social distancing, whoever came up with that? There's not much that's less social than acting as if everyone's unclean and dangerous, though the problem, of course, is that they are, or at least some of them are, and there's no way of knowing. Medical distance, they should call it. Or why not just safe distance? And when did distance become a verb? Language is also infected. Return George Orwell, England has need of thee. So Matt can't go to the post office tomorrow, and the grandchildren won't get the cookies. And it's Matt's friend, not Matt, coming over on Friday with her shopping. Nice lad, turns out. No, he looks, well, a bit dodgy, really. Hood up, eyes down. She should know better than that, to judge by appearances. Only appearances are a choice, aren't they? Anyway, he can take some cookies too. She hates the way they won't let her pay them or do anything at all. Very generous, of course, but there's a limit to how grateful you want to be, how helpless you want to feel. And she passed it a while ago. I was a whole person, she wanted to say. I worked my way up, managed a team and a budget, volunteered in this and that most of my life. I was bossy, still could be, given anyone to boss. Extremely vulnerable. Laura, that's her granddaughter, says bossy is gendered. No one calls a man bossy. They either take it for granted that men are like that, or they say authoritative or a good leader. She picks up another cookie. Some days you have to take comfort where you find it. She wanders over to the window. How did she forget that? Poor Matt, and especially poor Kate. She'll be going mad shut up in the house. She forgot because it was just a text message, that's why. Because your mind and memory can't get much purchase on pixels on a screen. That's probably why she's baking, to make something that wasn't there before. So there's a real new thing in her house. making friends with a biscuit. She's going to be befriending mice at this rate, like a prisoner in an old story. And it's the time of year, isn't it? The mice come in from the cold. Lots of people are getting dogs, worrying the sheep all summer, leaving mess everywhere. The farmer's fuming, though farmers do fume. Their natural state, too much time alone, probably no rest. But they're quite right about the sheep, and it'll be worse come lambing time. Doesn't bear thinking about. She leans her face against the glass to feel it cold and hard. No one's touched her in months. Not since she had that last lunch with Sheila back in March at the garden centre, and they did the air kissing thing they learnt late in life. No one's ever going to do that again, are they? Maybe she'll die without ever touching another human. Maybe she's had her last hug, handshake, air kiss. She realised at the funeral, in fact, standing there singing next to Susie, she'd almost certainly had the last sex of her life. She's come to terms with that mostly, sorts herself out when she needs it. But you can't hug yourself or pat your own shoulder. Well, the shoulder. No, that doesn't work at all. Oh, shut up, she thinks. Pull yourself together. Here you are, warm and comfortable in your nice house with your nice neighbours, arranging for their nice friends to bring you nice food. And there are people dying out there, children hungry and women locked up with men who beat them and nurses working 28 hours a day. You shut up and wash up. Stop patting yourself and put those cookies somewhere you're not going to eat them. More Springsteen. There's a reason they don't write protest anthems about well-off retired people feeling a bit sad. What is it they say? Check your privilege. And there it is, her privilege, in plain sight as always. But she's still leaning against the window, watching her breath miss the glass, thinking at least the condensation is material evidence that she's alive. When she sees Kate coming down the garden path next door, glancing left and right before she opens the gate and striding off up the lane. Hiking boots, backpack, no pretending she's just taking a breath of air. I should stop her, Alice thinks. She's breaking the law. But Kate's moving fast, and Alice just stands there, cheek to cheek with her window, watching. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I love that section, and the way that the kind of cookies become this sort of currency of sort of human intimacy in the novel. I was wondering if I can ask you sort of, something quite basic really, which is clearly this is a novel set in the pandemic. It's set in November 2020, that's right. And I was sort of working backwards, thinking about sort of publishing schedules and editing schedules, I suppose. And presumably you were kind of writing this in November 2020.
Yeah, certainly December, yeah.
And it sort of seems to me that sort of the way in which we kind of conceived the pandemic and lockdown and the sort of risk assessments that we're all asked to make and the cost benefit analyses that we're forced to do every time we kind of want some sense of human proximity during lockdown, that the sort of terms of that shift over time. And I was sort of wondering if you could just sort of talk a little bit about what it was like kind of writing this sort of in the moment, and whether when it came to kind of editing and proofing, your sort of views on some of the sort of those cost benefit analyses, those risk assessments had changed at all.
I think we're always kind of writing to the moment, though. I mean, whether it's explicit in the novel or not, even when I was writing historical fiction, I was reading the news and engaged with the world around me while I was doing it. And I was thinking about the historical fiction I was writing very much through the prism of the days I was living through. I mean, my historical fiction has a lot to do with medicine and healthcare. And I was certainly thinking about the NHS and the history of English healthcare while I was writing it. So I don't really think it's fundamentally different if your writing is more explicitly contemporary, because all writing is contemporary, really, whether it says so or not. No, I think it's the fact of those risk benefit analyses that became interesting, the way everything we did became a morally freighted decision. Am I going to nip out for a tin of tomatoes? And it wasn't, in the past that would just have been a question about, can I be bothered, or will I just kind of make do with, this rather tired fresh one and some ketchup or whatever. And now it becomes, am I going to kill somebody by nipping out for a tin of tomatoes? It's the way the volume on every little decision and every little action gets turned right up. And not only in your own head, it's not only, if I go out for a tin of tomatoes so I can finish this thing I'm in the middle of cooking, am I going to catch a fatal disease and give it to somebody and kill somebody? It's also, are my neighbours going to see me? Is the shopkeeper going to judge me? What are the other people in the shop going to think of me? It was the way everything became laden with that moral purport that was interesting, I think. And the exact, precisely how we think about it changes from person to person and from day to day. I noticed early on that everybody thinks that everyone who's more worried than they are is neurotic, and everybody who's less worried than they are is irresponsible. But in fact, how worried we are varies from day to day, depending on all sorts of things that have nothing to do with COVID. And, maybe you're just having a bad day and your anxiety levels go up. So yeah, no, I think.
Yeah, and the cookies become, at the center of one of these sort of cost benefit analyses. And I suppose this was sort of making me think about the, sort of how the way that we read the novel will probably change over time, I suppose. And it's, I think if I'd kind of read, so Alice is kind of wanting Kate's son to take a plate of cookies really as a sort of, and it's a sort of substitute for giving him a hug, really. And there's a sort of, and there's a discussion about sort of whether it's safe and, who might be putting who at risk. And I suppose, the way that it's, it's in a moment of kind of great human need where there's real need for kind of intimacy and proximity. And I suppose, as a reader, what, I found myself weighing up is sort of, well, there's the risk of transmission, but there's the kind of real human need for a hug or for, for closeness. And obviously that changes depending on kind of what we know about the pandemic and the way that it's transmitted. And I suppose I was sort of wondering, did you want the novel to be about the kind of the specifics of lockdown and the pandemic, or about the very nature of kind of those risk assessments, about the sort of more general things, I suppose, that the pandemic sort of puts under pressure and shines a light on?
Yeah, you won't be at all surprised that it's the latter. The pandemic itself is never actually named in the novel. I don't use the word COVID. And when I was writing it, it felt a bit like writing dystopian fiction, except that I didn't need to invent the dystopia because it was there. But I've been interested in epidemiology for a long time because it's really about human connection and the impossible. Epidemiology starts and ends with the idea that no one is an island. And that we are, even if we don't want to be connected, even if we deny our connection, even if we deny our economic and social connections, we're biologically connected to each other in ways over which we have no control whatsoever. And that's really the stuff of fiction. If you think about 19th century or 18th century novels, it's profoundly invested in exploring those inevitable and inescapable connections between people who may very well want to deny them.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's sort of there's a sort of section in the novel where you're talking about, I think Kate's making some soup, and she's sort of thinking about, the fact that she's making soup out of beans and out of vegetables that have kind of grown in the land that she is resident in. And she's thinking about sort of, whether, this is a link to history, I suppose, that these are in a way the kind of the same cells that are part of her that would be part of people who lived on that plot kind of hundreds of years ago. And it made me think of, I don't know if you've read a book called The Second Body by Daisy Hilliard, which is really interesting about how, in a way we have this sort of second body that exists outside of our sort of immediate self, and is this sort of form of connection, I suppose. But it sort of made me think about, the specifics of the geographical setting, I suppose, that the Fell is set in. And, all of your novels are so geographically placed and, have this wonderful relationship kind of with land. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, the decision to kind of to set it where you have set it.
Yeah, the settings of my novels are never really decisions because I start with the settings. So it begins with a kind of intuition around a place, and then everything else comes after that. So it's not that I think, let's set a novel in Northumberland or let's set a novel in Derbyshire. It's that a particular place, I don't know, I sort of want to say calls me or speaks to me, but that makes it sound mystical in ways I'm not very comfortable with. But I know that there are stories in places, and there are times when particular stories or places, call me, I guess, just seem to be in the right place at the right time. I know the Peak District very well. I grew up in Manchester, So the Peak District was our local, and doing a lot of hiking. So the Peak District was where we went often. And my parents live there now, in fact, quite near where the novel is set. It was partly, I think, that when I was writing it, for 7 months in Dublin, we were forbidden to go more than 5 kilometres from home, which I found to be a much more benign form of lockdown than the English one. I mean, you could leave the house as much as you wanted, whenever you wanted, and for as long as you wanted, but you couldn't go more than 5 kilometres. And I became quite interested in that almost medieval range. I mean, 5 kilometres is comfortable walking distance. And I began to think that probably most people in most times and places have had that kind of 10-kilometre circle is what you would naturally have if you didn't have vehicles. And it was easy for me because I'd just moved. So, my whole circle was new to me and I was quite glad to explore it. But it did mean I couldn't go to the mountains. I can see the Wicklow Mountains from all over the place around here, but I couldn't go to them, and I couldn't visit my parents, and I couldn't cross the water to England, and I couldn't go to the Peak District. So it was partly, I suppose, a love letter to a landscape from which I was exiled at the time.
Yeah, and it sort of seemed to me that there was, thinking about the sort of the history of the land, sort of speaking through the present as well, that there's something really resonant about the fact that, kind of Kinder Scout is the site of the mass trespass, and, it has such a history to do with freedom of movement. And this is to do with the curtailment of freedom of movement. And presumably that was deliberate.
Yes, or at least that's probably one of the reasons why I started with Kinder Scout. Because I was thinking so much about restriction and constraint and where you were allowed to go and where you weren't allowed to go. And yes, that mirroring of the Kinder trespass and then the police chasing people off the fells with drones, it seemed so circular.
Yeah. Yeah, so we had a kind of a reading group earlier today with some students at Newcastle University kind of discussing your book. And one student made a really perceptive point, which was, he was describing how he's from a village very similar to the village that your novel set, and, saying that actually it wasn't until he came back to university in Newcastle that he met anyone who had COVID or who knew anyone who had COVID, and that actually, thinking back to that sort of question of the sort of risk assessments that people made during the lockdown, he said that sort of, being from a village, it actually all seemed very abstract, but that the things that seemed kind of more immediate were the things like, the need for human contact, actually. And, was that sort of part of the intention as well, to sort of explore, I suppose, how the decisions that people make during lockdown are kind of, might be different, I suppose, in a village from a city?
Yes, and just generally thinking about the fracturing, but I think England was already so very fractured. But one of the new fracture lines that opened up, I think, was between people who lived in the places that other people wanted to visit and people who didn't. And my parents are in the Peak. Thing you could do for the people you really wanted to see was not see them. And if you really wanted to serve other people and serve your community, you should stay out of it. It's very, very odd. I mean, I hope it doesn't seem in any way like an anti-lockdown novel. That isn't what I was intending or thinking about or believe. But these strange contradictory impulses towards connection and separation and all of those ideas about contamination, which cannot but be political. I mean, however scientifically necessary, once we start categorizing people into the clean and the unclean, we have a huge political problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I didn't feel like it came across at all as an anti-lockdown novel, but, was in a way sort of exploring, as you say, the kind of the contradictory dynamics. And it seemed to me to be sort of, exploring, I'm sort of reminded of that phrase by the philosophers Simone Weil about, the needs of the soul. And that's actually, and, on one level, there's the need for kind of freedom of movement, but there's also the need for sort of intimacy and proximity, and sometimes those things can be contradictory.
Yes, absolutely. And people who had intimacy and proximity during lockdown usually had far more of it than they could tolerate. And people who had solitude had far more of it than they could tolerate. I mean, again, it really pushed us into extremes. And a lot of my friends have kids and were desperate for schools to open and for playgrounds to open and for the just to be, we were living in a small house with 4 of us, and fortunately, we all had the same need to get away from each other, and we were able to accommodate it. But in that first lockdown, when you're only allowed out for an hour a day, there was no way any of us were going out with any of the rest of us. We all wanted to be out and alone. But I knew other people who lived alone who were becoming just as desperate for human company. And normally those things kind of even themselves out, because those who want company can go out and seek it, and those who want solitude can seek it. But you couldn't do that.
Yeah. And in lots of ways, I think the representation of a community in confinement and the pressures that emerge out of that confinement sort of reminded me actually quite a lot of kind of night waking, I suppose. And, actually sort of, it's the same sort of confinement, but shining a light, I suppose, on those kind of gendered dynamics that emerge, and, the sort of the kind of variations, I suppose, between sort of being in confinement with a young child, with sort of being in confinement with a sort of slightly older child. But the novel is kind of quite kind of clear about the fact that those dynamics are gendered, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. And I was thinking also, when Kate goes out for her walk on her own at night, I was thinking also about so many of those narratives around women and the outdoors. We're constantly being told that it's dangerous to go out, and that, there are bad men lurking in the bushes, and really, if you go for a walk on your own, you're kind of asking for it. But if you look at the data, that's such nonsense. 3 women a week in the UK are killed by their partners, and almost all of those murders happen at home. And if you look at the number of teenage boys and young men who are killed on the streets, it's crazy that we think that it's safe for women to be inside and safe for men to be outside. The absolute opposite is true. And yet there's such an investment in the idea that women should stay home and stay safe, and men should go out and, own the public spaces. But that's actually quite dangerous for everybody.
Yeah, I kind of completely agree. But it sort of seems to me that, that sort of sense of kind of fear that is inculcated in women about the outdoors is something that, can become kind of quite sort of unfocused, can become a sort of generalized fear that sort of, yes, is about fear of harassment and assault, but also becomes about sort of fear of injury and, kind of lack of confidence in navigation, I suppose. And, did you sort of how, I suppose I sort of want to ask about the decision to make Kate have an accident, because I suppose in some level that does, possibly reinforce the idea that the outdoors is a place of danger.
Well, it is a place of danger. It's just that it's actually less dangerous to women than to men. Kate's accident is kind of necessary because one of the questions I think a lot of us asked ourselves, or rhetorically asked ourselves, is, oh, well, what harm can it do? And there is an answer to that question, actually. It was partly born of my own frustration at being prevented from doing things that it was obvious to me were perfectly safe and posed no risk to anybody. They do, really. I was going out cycling in the very early hours of the morning around the country lanes, thinking, I'm not touching anybody, I'm not in proximity to anybody, I could not conceivably do any harm to anybody. But I could have been knocked off my bike and ended up in hospital taking up resources. And then there's a question about, well, are you allowed to end up in hospital taking up resources? But of course, if we say that, there's the thing people say, oh, well, she brought it on herself. And I always think, how's that supposed to help? We all bring our worst troubles on ourselves. It's no comfort. But I think more than that, if we decide that people who've brought their troubles on themselves are not entitled to care, we deny care to almost everybody. Almost everything that happens to us as a result of our own actions in some way, shape or form. So then we're kind of there with the COVIDiots and the heroes. And again, that's such a divisive and pointless set of terms. And the people who were being told they were heroes were put under enormous pressure by that. A lot of my friends are medics. I lived with postgrad medics when I was doing my PhD. They didn't want to be heroes. They just wanted safe working conditions and decent pay and to be allowed to do their jobs like everybody else. And the people who were being told that they were idiots usually had perfectly logical and consistent reasons for doing what they were doing.
You've frozen, Sarah. I don't know if that's me or you.
You've frozen for me. Are you still hearing me? Oh, there we go. Is that better? Sorry. What was the last bit you heard?
About sort of living with medics and Yeah, and sort of medics not wanting to be heroes. Yeah.
Yes. So I think that whole heroes and idiots narrative was hugely destructive to both sides. And pretty much everybody who was being told that they were an idiot had reasons which to them would have been perfectly logical and consistent for doing what they were doing, or, you know, moments of overwhelming need for whatever it was. So really, I hope the book is finally about mercy and charity, rather than about a particular pandemic or something that happened in November 2020 or any of that. And I had the Heath scene from King Lear in the back of my mind all the time I was writing it. Reason not the need, our basest beggars are in the poorest things superfluous. Yeah. I kept trying to find a title for it from that scene, and I couldn't really. You can't call a novel Reason Not the Need, though I wanted to. But that scene seemed so, I think I read it differently when I was writing this book, but I wanted echoes. And there is a bit, I mean, Kate's thinking, thus threading dark-eyed night and trying to remember where it comes from, and she doesn't know, and she remembers going to Lear. But that moment of kind of madness and fall, and the most basic human need for warmth and shelter and just a little charity, I want to be at the core of this one.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, you know, that's kind of one of the things with sort of risk assessment, I think, is that, you know, there's this sort of seductive idea that, you know, it's possible to just come down clearly on one side or the other. And actually, often it's just a matter of, you know, it's a matter of recognizing that two things can be true at the same time. You know, that sort of question about the sort of danger of the outdoors for women. It's like, well, it can be true simultaneously that the outdoors is a place of danger, but that also the danger is overstated for women. You know, both these things can be true. And I think the novel sort of brilliantly captures that, and the kind of, you know, the wrestling that it makes all of us do, really. But it's sort of interesting to hear you you know, sort of talk about the sort of intertextual references that are, you know, that are in the novel. And I suppose, you know, the title of it is, you know, sort of, to me, brings up sort of ideas of the fall, I suppose. And, you know, and I was sort of interested in the fact that actually Kate's own fall, or the sort of physical fall off the fell, isn't actually described. And you know, it reminded me a little bit of John McGregor's most recent novel, Lean, Fall, Stand, where actually the fall is, you know, really elaborated in kind of quite a lot of detail. And I suppose I was sort of wondering if you could talk a little bit about your decision to sort of, for the fall to take place kind of off stage.
Well, partly it leaves open ideas about whether it's a fall or a jump, which... Yeah. I mean, nobody's really talked about that, but it is, you know, it's kind of floating in the book as a possibility. But also Kate doesn't remember it, and there are no witnesses. So it's one of those, I mean, as in the tidal zone, really, it's one of those events that can only be imagined because it's not known, you know, whether the only participant is also the only witness, and she doesn't remember, so we don't know.
Yeah, and you know, I love the way that these you know, these kind of intertextual, you know, and the songs as well, the protest songs that are kind of woven through, you know, in a way it sort of seemed to be enacting that sort of idea that, you know, the kind of, you know, like your representation of history seems very organic, you know, that there is this sort of sense of the soil kind of coming up through the, you know, the house that they're living in, the soil with its kind of memory of history, sort of quite similar in a way to the kind of the bog girl, I suppose, in Ghostwall. And, you know, it must be so resonant, this, you know, setting this in a sort of area of peat bog, I suppose, this sort of, you know, the sense of the organic nature of preservation of history. But I found it interesting that this was something that one of the students in the reading group sort of brought up, that, you know, she found it really moving that Alice was kind of singing these protest songs, but there were sort of protest songs of kind of communal protest, but she was sort of, you know, dancing around her kitchen to them and making them in a way into an act of private protest that, you know, in a way it was a sort of act of, you know, I'm going to claim pleasure where I can in the face of cancer, I suppose. And you know, it just made me sort of really interested, I suppose, in the fact that, you know, that sort of mass protest was very hard during the pandemic and during lockdown, and that actually our sort of acts of protest become kind of individual ones. And yeah, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes, I think that was one of the biggest and most troubling losses, the difficulty of protest. And I mean, the Black Lives Matter protests happened during it. But do you remember how very hard it was to explain to some people that there were people for whom Black Lives Matter was more important than COVID, and that there were people who were more at risk from racism than they were from COVID? And again, the risk assessment, the recognition that priorities could be different for different people and that was legitimate, was strangely difficult. And certainly in England, I mean, the narrative about heroes and the bloody clapping, I mean, it was so monolithic. You must participate or you are an enemy. It's very strange. There was no space for intelligent dissent. I mean, you could try and deny the whole thing and engage in conspiracy theories, but there wasn't really, and possibly still isn't, much space to say, I accept science, I believe in truth, I recognize objective reality, I accept the data, but we have a problem. And that's quite frightening. And yes, I suppose the folk songs and to some extent Alice's dancing are small ways of recognizing that we're not actually all singing from the same hymn sheet.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a bit about sort of technology in the novel, because it sort of seems to me that that technology kind of offered something, I suppose, during this kind of long period of human separation, and that actually sort of some protest, I suppose, could take place sort of virtually, but sort of technology has quite a kind of complex place in the novel, and I think particularly as it affects a character who we haven't spoken about yet, which is who's Matt, the teenage son of Kate. And I was just wondering if you could sort of talk a little bit about kind of the place of technology in the novel, and I think particularly sort of how it shapes kind of Matt's experience of the pandemic and lockdown.
Yeah, I think technology is simultaneously alienating and consoling, and probably differently for different people at different times. Matt is a gamer. So for him, there's another world in his computer which he can slip into. And I mean, both of my sons have had long gaming phases, and I'm interested in the way their absorption is like and unlike my absorption in fiction. I mean, they both read as well, so you can kind of compare and contrast. For Matt, the technology offers a very peaceable way out. So when he's told he has to isolate for 14 days, he just thinks, oh, cool, 14 days of gaming and nobody trying to make me go out in the cold. And that really is all right for him. And he really is connecting with his friends online and doing something that he finds engaging and interesting and challenging. I suppose what we think about that depends on how you see escapism, but I think lockdown and particularly isolation necessitate escapism. I mean, I can't see any other way of doing it. For Alice, the technology is a very mixed blessing. I mean, it enables her to stay in touch with her daughter and her daughter's family, but she feels quite coerced by that a lot of the time. And in some ways, it just reminds her that she can't see anybody in real life. And Kate really rejects technology. I mean, she hates her phone. She avoids using computers. She's utterly committed to the real.
One of the students from today's reading group very cleverly, I think, sort of pointed out that, kind of Zoom functions as a window in the novel, and that you have a kind of consistent thread of windows as metaphors. There's lots of characters leaning up against windows, and that, sort of windows act both as something that kind of, establishes a limited sense of connection. We can at least look at each other, but not a kind of profound sort of physical sense of connection. Yeah. And once you'd made, I thought, like, the lovely point that kind of windows are see-through walls, like ghost walls.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Summerwater is also very interested in windows. Yes, that's a very good student.
Yeah, I thought that was a brilliant point. I thought I'd steal it for tonight, but then I thought I'd better attribute it. I was wondering if you might be able to kind of let us into Matt's voice a little bit, and if it would be possible for you to read a short section.
Of course, yeah. So Kate has slipped out. She hasn't told Matt where she's going. So Matt was gaming upstairs and kind of vaguely beginning to wonder where his mum is, but not too worried. And now we join Matt. This chapter is called Watching the Badgers. Matt's finished his maths and he's hungry. The house is still unlit and silent, but on the landing he calls, "Mum, Mum, you here?" Her bedroom door is open the way he left it, and even in the darkness he can see that there's no one there. Although usually he wouldn't bother, can move around this house just fine at night. He turns on the light to go down the stairs and sees her wellies lying in the hall. He doesn't think they were there earlier, so maybe she was out and has come in very quietly without turning on a light. The kitchen is also dark, but he goes in to see if she might be in the bathroom. There's no light under the door. She isn't in the front room either. He goes back to the hall, pushes his big feet into her small wellies and minces to the back door, which is unlocked. The cat appears and peers out, decides sensibly against it. It's fully dark now, no moon, only the shadow of the house blocked out by the streetlight at the front. He can still see the apple tree many-fingered against the sky and the stones of the flagged path. "Mum," he calls, "Mum, if she's fallen, maybe? Mum." He'd be able to see her if she were lying here. And how could she fall, raking leaves? He turns back, excites the cat by going into the kitchen and opening the cupboard where they keep the cat food, as well as the first aid kit, the batteries, candles for power cuts and a torch. The torch needs new batteries, but it'll do. And he goes back out and blunders around on the wet grass, making sure. Back in the house, he tugs off her little boots. Okay, fine. She's gone out when she shouldn't have done. It's not exactly surprising, but she could have told him. "If you're going up the hills," she's been saying to him, probably since he could walk, "don't go alone. And if you do go alone, tell someone where you're going and when you plan to be back." Not that he does go up the hills much. So what's she playing at? Maybe she hasn't gone up the hills, maybe just the woods or up the lane. He's going to call her. He hears over the burr of his phone the tinkle of hers, the old-fashioned jingle he gave up trying to make a change. "This is Kate, please leave." He ends the call and tries again. "This is Kate, please." Tracks her ringtone up the stairs and then doesn't need the sound to find her phone plugged in by her bed, where it's probably been all day and maybe longer. Right then, okay. We have conclusively established, he thinks, that Mum has left the house, has broken quarantine and is out somewhere without her phone. Mum has broken the law. So there you go. He'll just have to wait, and meanwhile he might as well cook, have something ready for her when she comes back. He feeds the cat. The sound of the biscuits falling into the bowl seems to echo off the kitchen walls. He does cook proper dinners sometimes, well, once or twice. He opens the fridge, which is half empty. Eggs from the farm up the road, either been there over a week or Mum went out another time, and he doesn't think she did. Need eating then. Omelette, he can do that, not much washing up. They'll have to wash the frying pan before he gets started. No cheese, what else can you put in an omelette? He looks it up on his phone. Spanish omelette, which requires you to have cooked potatoes already. Ham, nope. Mushrooms, maybe? He opens the drawers at the bottom of the fridge, which are usually the last staging post before the compost heap. There are some grey wrinkled things like dead slugs, which he remembers being parsnips once. There's a brown paper bag, but it contains something that looks like miniature ginger root and is orange inside when he snaps it. He sniffs it, good, can still smell, and not ginger, and no mushrooms. Smoked salmon, suggests the internet, fresh herbs. How about kale, he wonders, could that play the role of a fresh herb? Not that he wants to go out there and contend with the real slugs. Masala omelette, which wants onion, green chilli, and a bunch of spices that are probably in the cupboard. That'll do, and the pan doesn't need to be all that clean. He peels an onion, starts chopping. He's cold. Put another jumper on, she'd say. He can't remember Mum ever breaking the law before. Not speeding. The car doesn't go all that fast anyway. You'd worry something would fall off. There's a roll of duct tape in the glove compartment for good reasons. But she wouldn't drive fast, even in a better car. Doesn't really like driving at all. Probably the nearest he's come to dying is last year when she skidded on the hill doing an emergency stop to avoid a rabbit. I'd never forgive myself, she says, if I hurt someone. But he's thinking he's not sure she ever forgives herself anyway. For being alive, for having a carbon footprint, for using the NHS. Not that she does use it much. Most things get better if you wait, she says. We'll leave the doctor for people who need her. What if she does need a doctor? What if she's fallen out there in the dark? He tips the onions into the pan, wipes his nose on the back of his hand. That's onions, not emotion. She doesn't fall. Her night vision's better than his. Maybe she's just watching the badgers or something. He finds the jug and cracks eggs. Should possibly have washed them first because there's chicken poo on the shell. Checks his phone with an eggy finger. He's supposed to add the chopped chili and spices. Chili flakes will have to do. The cat comes and winds around his ankles. Where's Mum got to then? He asks her. The spices are all in little glass jars, unlabelled. He opens something that looks like cumin, sniffs, right sort of sweaty smell, gets a nose of chili from what's clearly not paprika. He can't really smell the next one, but chucks them in anyway, and the onions are a bit burnt. She's not going to be back, is she, in time to eat this? He beats up the eggs, pushes the onion into the jug so he can cook half the mixture now and save half, which is also a reason not to wash up. More oil, half the egg back in. He looks out into the garden, suddenly doesn't like seeing himself in the kitchen reflected out there. The toaster and kettle under the skeletal tree, the fruit bowl with its never ripening pears on the dewy grass. He folds the omelette, not bad, squashes it a bit so the uncooked egg runs out. No one would post a photo, but it looks edible. Doesn't take long to eat a small omelette. He squeezes a pear, but they're still not ripe. Might be a bit of ice cream, it's too cold. The biscuit tin's empty and the packet he thought he'd seen in the cupboard isn't there. Toast and jam then. He takes a new loaf from the freezer and uses the bread knife to leave the slices off the end. And tea. Mum will be glad to find tea in the pot when she comes in. He takes his toast back upstairs, gets under the duvet, flicks around for something to watch, but there isn't anything, and he doesn't feel like going back to the game. The cat comes to curl up on his belly. He maybe dozes a little.
Thank you so much. I found it really interesting that, your novels kind of quite consistently deal with the experience of parenthood and with sort of children's experiences at sort of various points in kind of the life cycle, really. And, sort of night waking is so kind of intense in that sort of encapsulation of sort of parenting a sort of very young child, I suppose. But sort of increasingly in your novels, you seem sort of, the focus seems to have shifted to teenagers and teenagers' experience. And I was sort of wondering, if you can talk a little bit about that shift of focus from sort of young children like Moth to the sort of teenagers in kind of the tidal zone and Ghost Wall and Matt, obviously. And I suppose sort of, what kind of dynamics are sort of put under pressure, I suppose, by the sort of act of parenting at these different life stages?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, the obvious answer is that my writing career has overlapped exactly with my parenthood. My youngest child was 3 when my first novel was published, so I was writing it, around the time I was pregnant with him. So I suppose it's not surprising that the children in my books have aged along with the children. I mean, not that the children in my books bear any particular relation to the children in my life, but the opportunity to observe the stages of life has gone along with my writing. I think I've always been interested in teenagers. I mean, being a university lecturer means that you see the top end of that stage a lot. And I've always loved it and been fascinated by, I suppose, the engagement of that age group with the world around them and often the clarity of vision that we all lose. And I remember being that age and thinking, yeah, I will never compromise. I will never get into all those shades of grey that the middle-aged go on about. And of course I have, and of course you do, and of course they will in their time. But I think it's such an interesting stage of life, both to be in and to observe. And when I think about my own adolescence, it so fundamentally shaped my adult life in ways that I had no means of recognising at the time. And it's probably good that I didn't, because it would have been terrifying. But that was, for example, when I started going on archaeological digs. And the dig that ended up giving me Cold Earth was one I was on when I was 17. My interest in the Scottish Islands also, I mean, it goes back before then, but that was when I was able to do it independently. I spent a lot of time in Orkney with my grandparents as a child, but returning as a teenager, traveling independently for the first time, gave me a different kind of relationship with it. And I think for me, that stage was so much about physical independence, about travel, being in the outdoors, being able to decide to go a place and go there and not having to tell people or ask people. And it takes different shape now, but it's a period that's always fascinated novelists, isn't it? And I always think now when I'm teaching the 19th century novel, this is all actually YA. I mean, pretty much all of the heroes and heroines of 19th century fiction begin in childhood and end at most in their early 20s. So I think it's always been a striking time. Though I'm also now interested in writing middle age for blatantly obvious reasons.
And I mean, have you found that sort of different creative forms are necessary to kind of give voice to sort of the interiority of adolescence?
I don't think so. I think pretty much any form can do pretty much any job. And I was just thinking about writing the children in Summerwater, where there's a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old. No, I think form flexes.
That's interesting. I want to ask you a bit more about sort of kind of form and kind of creative practice, I suppose, in relation to kind of what you yourself say quite explicitly in the Fell, where you say humanity's ending appears to be slow, lacking in cliffhangers or indeed any satisfactory narrative shape, characterized for the lucky by the gradual vindication of accumulating dread. And it is a novel of accumulating dread. And I guess I was just wondering if you could sort of expand on that a little bit, just by sort of talking about, the sort of experimenting and creative thinking you've been undergoing, I suppose, in terms of finding a kind of fictional shape to encapsulate what you call the end times.
Well, of course, we don't know. People have always thought they're living in the end times, but on the other hand, the evidence is pretty good at the moment. I think one of the things that makes it very difficult for us to engage intelligently with the world, though also something that saves us often, is our sense that there are structures in life in the way that there are structures in stories. And the great joy of fiction is that it comes with a beginning, a middle, and an ending. I mean, not just an end, but an ending. And I think endings are one of the hardest things to write because they're most fictional. I mean, life doesn't provide you with an ending ever. And fiction must. I mean, even if you decide to end it in some wildly unconventional way, there has to be an ending, and it has to be in some way satisfactory. And I think when we think about end times, we tend to reach for fiction. Is which of the four horsemen is it going to be? How is it going to be? What will the explosion at the end be? And maybe it won't, maybe it just kind of very gradually peters out. And certainly our experience of climate change, and I don't think this pandemic is going to be the end of the world at all. I think climate change is a much bigger crisis. It doesn't have narrative shape, and that's one of the things that makes it so hard to grip. And the other thing about these stories is that I'm always interested in the space between the scale on which we actually live our lives, which is domestic and intimate and personal and minute by minute and hour by hour, and the scale on which we think about the world, which is at least global and sometimes universal, and involves these enormous trajectories of time and space and people. And that's one of the things that makes it so difficult to respond intelligently to climate change, because it's, when I say, well, the world's not going to end because I take one extra Ryanair flight to London, that's patently true. Tell Elon Musk to stop firing things into space before you tell me not to fly Ryanair to London. On the other hand, if we all think that, then the world is going to end while we stand there saying, well, it's somebody else's problem. But that's a real issue. I mean, it's not that we should all immediately turn our fridges off and stop having showers and all the rest of it. It's that we have to find some way of crossing that space over and over and over again. And the same is true, really, of any moral kind of dilemma. I mean, you have to find some way of navigating the space between, I don't want to hurt people and I desperately need to get out of the house at this moment. Because we live in our own heads and our own feelings, but we are able to think and imagine and understand and speak and communicate on a scale that we can't always deal with in our heads and our feelings. And I think one of the things I'm interested in my novels is just juxtaposing those, working back and forth across that very difficult space between experience and knowledge.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things I love about the novel so much, is kind of like that kind of refusal to provide a neat resolution, that actually, I don't want to kind of give away the ending, but actually the ending isn't really an ending. It's kind of in a way a beginning.
Yes.
And, and that's kind of really interesting. And it sort of reminded me actually of, because I desperately want to bring in the monkeys just before we kind of run out of time. But I was, talking in this reading group about the experiments with baby monkeys, where they're put into a cage and they're given the choice of a kind of wire mother who will provide them with milk, or a cloth mother that will provide them with some degree of sort of physical comfort. And then the monkeys are scared and they tend to run to the cloth mother. But what I found really interesting is that the students in the reading group, their main interest in this case study was not what I kind of initially drew from it, I suppose, which was that, this is about the need for human physical connection. They were worried about what happened to the monkeys next, about the fact that, as Alice identified, you're left with a whole load of messed up monkeys. And so in a way, I found that really interesting, that they'd latched onto something that I think was kind of far more kind of, cleverer than what I'd latched onto, which is kind of that what seems like a neat resolution, a neat ending, a neat conclusion. Oh, this shows that monkeys and humans need human connection, is actually not the whole story, and that there's something that comes afterwards. And often we don't know what that is that comes afterwards, but it's about that sort of that chain of events, how each individual decision might kind of cascade to something else.
Absolutely. And that's Lear again, as flies to wanton boys are we to the gods, they kill us for their sport. I mean, what is Harry Harlow there if not the wanton boy killing flies for sport? I mean, for me, that experiment is much more about cruelty than about anything it tells you. And what it tells you is perfectly obvious. We all knew that anyway. But yes, it bequeaths presumably generations of profoundly traumatized monkeys. And here we all are.
Yeah, and that's kind of Kate's, what we initially think of as Kate's one decision, whether to go for this walk or not, is actually not one decision. It's part of a whole series of decisions. It's part of, just on a very basic level, do I just go this far, or do I keep going, or do I keep going? But it's actually part of all the decisions in her life that have kind of led to that moment. And and that's not the end. It's the beginning of more decisions that will come further as well. And and I love that sense of kind of actually giving us a sort of pressurized snapshot in time. But it's not the world that you're giving us in The Fell isn't a kind of isolated, discrete world, discrete instance. It's part of a whole chain of events and a whole chain of human connections, and raises questions that are applicable kind of everywhere.
Good.
Anyway, I will leave you now. I'll let you go. And I've sort of interrogated you for long enough, but it's such a fascinating novel, and it really kind of had that effect of both reflecting back to me, I think, sort of what lockdown was like, and reminding myself of sort of details and anxieties and dynamics that I'd sort of forgotten about, but also kind of framing it in a sort of far more interesting and sort of illuminating light than I had, sort of ever considered. So thank you so much for writing the novel and for talking to us tonight. And you just have to imagine the whole sort of virtual audience giving you a round of applause. But thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for a great conversation.